Why we love the Song Dynasty, exploring the history and charm of one of China's most fascinating dynasties. Episode 8, a Song Dynasty foam party. In this podcast, we're taking a first look at the Song Dynasty's fascination, if not obsession, with drinking tea, and how it perfectly complemented the character of the people of the Song. I'm Bob Jones, and in this Why We Love the Song Dynasty podcast, I'm throwing the spotlight on what was to become one of China's most iconic dynasties in the country's long and colourful history. As British through and through, the subject of this podcast is very close to my heart indeed. We're going to talk tea. Both in China and the UK, tea is often seen as a social necessity, but I would say in very different ways. In the UK, tea is often the first drink of the day, but also whenever we need refreshment, during a tough job, and whenever we are faced with a problem that needs some thought. We often say, "Let's have a cup of tea." We do have a tea ceremony of sorts, which is steeped in controversy. Choose the right kind of tea. Warm the teapot. Add 1 spoonful for each person and 1 for the pot. Let it brew. Milk in the cup. Pour the tea. Sip it and exclaim, "Ah!" Just about every aspect of that age-old ceremony is in dispute, and you'll usually find true tea drinkers will insist on making their own cup themselves. A bad cup of tea is a terrible disappointment, and people often choose their friends based on how they like their tea. Okay, so it's not a ritual on the scale that you find in China, but it's still taken very seriously indeed. There must be something about tea, though, because the word serious comes nowhere near describing the importance of tea to our friends in the Song Dynasty. The history of tea drinking in China predates the Song period by quite some way, and the type of tea enjoyed and the way it was drunk have changed markedly over the centuries. As all good things in China, the story of tea begins with a legend. Once upon a time, and remember, this is just a story, there was an emperor called Nung. Now, he may or may not have existed, we just don't know, but it doesn't matter because it's a nice story, and tea had to have been invented somehow. So legend has it, he liked his drinking water boiled so that it would be clean. That's a habit still practiced in China today. One day, out with his army, he stopped for a rest. He was served up his water as usual, but unnoticed, a leaf fell into the water from a nearby bush, turning it brown. The emperor drank it and found it very refreshing. The date, often cited for this earth-shattering event, is 2737 BC, but there are absolutely no records around to confirm or deny the story. As a plant, tea originates in the mountain wilderness of southwestern China, in Yunnan and Sichuan provinces. Before being grown as a cash crop, they grew large and wild everywhere. The earliest tea was simply a whole leaf infusion, dropped directly into a cup of water. It was often used as a stimulant to keep people awake longer. It was very expensive and only really available to people with large pockets like emperors and high-ranking nobles and officials. Tea culture really took off under the Tang Dynasty, another great dynasty before the Song, and it became something to be enjoyed with friends. becoming one of the 7 essentials of Chinese life, along with firewood, rice, oil, salt, fermented sauces, and vinegar. This is roughly when the processing of tea started to get more complex. The tea leaves were selected, steamed and pressed into bricks known as tea cakes. The cakes were then ground down on a stone mortar and doused in hot water to create the final product. Later, the finest tips of the tea plant were dried and roasted to make the loose-leaf tea that we recognize today. This is where the Song Dynasty picks up the story. For the people of the Song, enjoying tea is a bit of a perfect storm. We know they enjoyed the finer things in life, loved getting together and being sociable, had infinite patience and were total show-offs. Later in the series, we'll see how they were seriously into porcelain too. Basically though, tea was made for them, and they were made for tea. Especially as tea drinking was regarded as a way to refresh the mind in order to meditate and attain enlightenment. The Song inherited a tea textbook from previous generations, called the Classic of Tea, by a chap called Lu Yu. In it, he described in minute detail how to prepare tea in the correct way, namely that lumps of tea should be ground into a powder and then brewed in the pot. He also introduced the practice of tea foam. Whereas the Tang Dynasty tea makers liked a bit of a foam on their tea, the Song Dynasty aficionados, in keeping with their showy sense of fun, liked loads and loads of foam. The secret was in the way they added the water. They didn't swamp the tea, but dribbled it in gradually, and then used a brush to whip up a complete foam storm. It was seen as a skill, and during the Song period, officials would often down tools to see who could make the best foam. The practice was banned by later generations, and officials told to just get on with your work. Song Emperor Huizong was seriously into his tea and wrote a treatise on the correct way to make it. He held tea-making competitions and even appointed a tea commissioner. More on the imperial liking for tea in our next podcast. You too can enjoy a cup of tea just like in the Song Dynasty. Huizong describes the process like this. His treatise was written in 1107, by the way. Step 1. Stir a little hot water into your tea paste very slowly. Use a bamboo whisk. Increase your speed gradually. You've got to make it look easy, but keep whisking until you start creating a foam. Step 2. Pour in a little more water. Strike the tea surface and then start beating the tea paste with a circular motion. The liquid's colour and lustre begin to show. Step 3. The third pouring. Whisk lightly in a circular motion, and by now you'll be able to see the tint of the liquid. White, or with a hint of green, was regarded as the pinnacle of fashion. Step 4. Pour in a little more water, gently whisk, and light clouds will start to appear. Step 5. Speed up your whisking until the fog freezes and the snow condenses. Step 6. Pour in water again. Lightly brush the floating spots of milky broth. Step 7. Pour water again. Appreciate how the water and liquid have blended. Remember, this is the Song Dynasty, and appreciation was needed for everything. It should now be opaque, snow white, with a rich foam on top of a tea soup. Now, it may well be that today you'll choose your coffee shop according to who makes the best foam on top of your cappuccino, especially if they can make those pretty little shapes on top. The go-to person during the 5 dynasties, just before the Song came along, was a Buddhist monk called Fu Chuen. He was the Elvis Presley of tea foam, and was renowned for being able to make pictures appear in the foam. Like a showman taming a lion, he could control the foam to show off its aesthetic beauty, often surrounded by hordes of admiring people. The best tea in the Song Dynasty came from Zhenzhou in Fujian. The tea garden was to the east of the city, next to a phoenix mountain covered in tea bushes. The tea was plucked in early spring, best before Qingming Festival, round about the third solar term, which is called Awakening of the Insects. There are 24 solar terms in the Chinese lunar year, each quite specific. They were meant to guide farmers about the best time to plant, tend and harvest their crops. The imperial family required everyone should go plucking tea on the mountain. Sung records at the time show there were up to 30,000 people plucking tea buds, which were then dried and pressed into cakes. Your tea set was crucial. It had to be porcelain, heavy and black, which was best to show off the colour of the fantastic foam. As we know by now, everything in the Song Dynasty was connected, exuberant, took time to do properly, and was inspired by the emperor. More on that in the next podcast. Special thanks go out to Sanlian Zhongdu for their help in creating the content for this show. This is Bob Jones. Thanks for listening. Join me again next time.